Hello everyone, this is Giraffe. Today we are going to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are one of the most famous archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. In 1947, a 16-year-old shepherd boy discovered some ancient scrolls in a cave near the Dead Sea. At the time of discovery, these scrolls were stored inside clay jars. The main material was parchment. They looked very ancient. The scrolls were filled with Hebrew writing. The teenager who found the scrolls was Arab and could not read, so he had no idea what was written on them. Later, after identification, these scrolls turned out to be over 2,000 years old, the oldest known copies of the Old Testament in existence. Before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest version of the Old Testament was called the Leningrad Codices, which was about 1,000 years old. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls pushed the oldest version of the Bible back by another 1,000 years, so it was definitely a monumental discovery of the century. But these are only copies. There must be even older versions. Of course, the content of the Dead Sea Scrolls is not just copies of the Old Testament. They also include many stories that are not recorded in the Bible. You mean stories not included in the current Bible? Yes, stories that people didn't know existed before. Then this discovery was made, and people thought, oh, so that happened too. That kind of feeling. Actually, whenever people talk about Bible stories, many might feel that these things don't really have too much to do with us. But one thing is undeniable. The Bible, starting from several thousand years ago, has played a very significant role in human civilization and human development. Even now, the source of faith for more than half of the world's population comes from the Bible. So it can be said that no other book in history has had an influence comparable to the Bible. Yet, the origin of the book remains a mystery. Whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament, no one knows who wrote them. The content of the book is also a mystery. We only know that it contains some words of God and some things about God. Wasn't it written by Moses? Right, speaking of Moses, what we know so far is that the Bible had many authors. These authors lived in different periods, spanning as much as 1,000 years. The authors also came from different places and had different religious backgrounds. So, why did they end up producing a single version of the Bible? Different religious backgrounds? Yes, they might have been different branches of Judaism with different stances, but what they wrote was the same. Why they ultimately produced one consistent version is not well understood. So, were there two people writing at roughly the same time? Yes, there were. How do we know? There were many authors. Not because the handwriting is different. The handwriting is all the same, because all these are copies. Copying was done by one person, so the handwriting is consistent. How do we know the authors were different? Because the vocabulary used is somewhat different. The way God is referred to is slightly different. In one section, God is called by one name. In another section, God is called by a different name. But in Hinduism, the same God is called by different names in different periods, right? Yes, that's also true. Also, there are some contradictions. For example, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, was originally believed to have been written by Moses himself. Yet within these texts, there are descriptions of situations that occur after Moses' death. Whether the content of the Bible is historical fact, who wrote it, and whether the content has been altered. To solve these mysteries, we need to find older versions of the Bible. Finding the very first version of the Bible might allow us to understand how God came to be. From this perspective, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls holds great significance for the study of the Bible and the study of human history. The place where these scrolls were originally discovered is called Qumran. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, this place was already an archaeological site. There was an ancient city there, but later it was found that the Dead Sea Scrolls had no direct relationship with this ancient city. The scrolls are even older than the city. That is, the city was built on top of the scrolls. But in 1947, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, this place was under Jordanian administration. Now, it is part of an Israeli national park. Because these scrolls were all discovered in caves near the Dead Sea, they are called the Dead Sea Scrolls or Dead Sea manuscripts. After the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, a large number of archaeologists and religious scholars came to this site to investigate. As a result, over the next 10 years, a total of 11 caves were discovered, all containing various kinds of ancient scroll fragments, also stored inside clay jars. When these fragments were assembled, they totaled over 900 documents. Among them, 200 documents are related to Old Testament. The remaining 600 plus documents contain additional content beyond the Old Testament, such as biblical commentaries, apocrypha, and pseudepigrapha. What is pseudepigrapha? Pseudepigrapha refers to content created based on biblical stories, essentially secondary creations. That is, the same characters are used, but additional or different stories are told. These stories are not recognized by the religion, so they are called pseudepigrapha. So they were still placed together with the Old Testament? Yes, and that's part of the mystery. We will get to that in a moment. Whether they are actually pseudepigrapha or not, nobody knows. Then who named them pseudepigrapha? Modern people. Modern religious scholars look at them and said, this doesn't match what our religion teaches. Oh, so modern people gave them the name pseudepigrapha. Yes, they think this must be fake, written by some authors as their own creations, making up their own stories, because the Bible doesn't have these stories. So, don't people actually want to hear the pseudepigrapha? Yes, and today we are going to focus on that too. There are also some contents related to treasure. Most recently, in 2017, a 12th cave was discovered, and in March 2021, a new cave was discovered, not at Qumran, but elsewhere. The content was similar, some fragments, a large amount, not too many, but they were determined to be from the same period. Alright, now let's talk about some details. Specifically, how did the young shepherd boy discover the scrolls? He was herding his sheep. At some point, he noticed one lamb was missing, so he started looking everywhere. Then he saw a cave there. He thought the lamb might have gone inside, but he was afraid to go in, so he threw stones into it. Then, crash! He heard the sound of a clay jar breaking. Eventually, he went inside and found some broken jars. Inside one of them was a scroll. He took it out, saw that it was covered in writing, couldn't read it, but felt that it might be worth something. Wasn't it a very hidden cave? It was very hidden. Ordinary people wouldn't go there. He only went because he was looking for his sheep. That area is full of caves because it's near the Dead Sea, where the salt concentration is extremely high. The salt has eroded the ground terribly, leaving caves everywhere. So the boy brought back 4 scrolls. He took them to the nearest large city to his home, called Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. Yes, there he found an antique dealer and sold the scrolls to him. That man's name was candle. Candle realized that these items were related to religion as they were covered in Hebrew. He himself was a member of the Eastern Orthodox Church, a branch of Christianity. So he took the scrolls to the local Eastern Orthodox archbishop to show him. He said, "I have something good. Come and take a look." The archbishop looked at them and was amazed. He bought them for 24 pounds. At that time, it was 24 Palestinian pounds, equivalent to about $1,300 today. That were still expensive, quite expensive. Later, two archaeology professors from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, one named Suknik and the other named Mazar, found out about this. They felt that this might be the oldest copies of the Old Testament in existence. They might also solve the mysteries of the Bible, so they really wanted them. However, at that time, relationships between Israel and Jordan were very bad. Professor Suknik and Mazar risked their lives to go to Bethlehem to buy 3 scrolls from Kendall. What does that mean? Kendall had originally received 4 scrolls and sold them to the archbishop. Later, the 2 boys, shepherds, sold him 3 more. It was at this point that the 2 archaeology professors learned that Kendall had already sold 4 scrolls to Archbishop Samuel. How did they find out? Actually, Kendall had been spreading the news everywhere, saying, "I have these items. If anyone wants, buy them. Come and find me." He wanted to sell them at a high price. He knew that the Israelis would want them even more. When the 2 professors heard there were 4 more scrolls, they immediately tried to contact Archbishop Samuel, saying they wanted those 4. Price was no object. Archbishop Samuel, hearing that someone was willing to pay a high price for the scrolls, promptly sent them to America to have them authenticated. At first, he was also worried they might be fake. The American Schools of Oriental Research conducted tests and found that, in terms of material, content, script, and grammar, the scrolls were very similar to the Nash papyrus, which had been discovered in Egypt in 1898. The Nash papyrus had already been dated to the 1st century BC. That meant if the Dead Sea Scrolls were the same, they might also be from the 1st century BC, over 2,000 years old. That also meant these scrolls would be even more valuable than the Nash papyrus, because the Nash papyrus was just a fragment, while these were full scrolls. After learning that the scrolls were valuable, Archbishop Samuel brought them back and hid them. But not long after, 1948, the Middle East War broke out. Israel and the surrounding countries went to war. Archbishop Samuel was afraid the scrolls would be seized by the Israelis. So he started contacting American universities and museums, asking, "Do you want these scrolls? Name a price. I will send them to you." However, all the American museums and universities were afraid to buy them. If the scrolls were fake, they would have been scammed. If they were real, they still didn't dare to buy them, because it might cause international disputes. With no other option, Archbishop Samuel finally placed a newspaper advertisement. "I have 4 Dead Sea Scrolls dating to 200 BC for sale at 250,000. Publicly selling them?" Yes, publicly selling them. At the time, 250,000 was roughly equivalent to over 2 million today. The advertisement was answered immediately, bought by an anonymous buyer. Later, people found out who the buyer was. It was the son of that Israeli professor who had originally gone to Bethlehem. Basically, the Israeli said still had money. If you dare to put it up for sale, we can buy it. In this way, Israel successfully recovered all 7 of the original scrolls. So, those professors might just have been doing a side job. Yes, their main profession was being wealthy magnates. Exactly. Now, these scrolls are kept in the shrine of the book at the Israel National Library, a place specifically designed to house the Dead Sea Scrolls. After the initial shepherd found the 7 scrolls, researchers quickly went to the area and began searching for more. But for 2 years, not a single new scroll was found. Then, in January 1949, another cave was discovered, and it contained many scrolls. After that, nothing again for a while. 3 years later, in 1952, it was suddenly noticed that some fragments were circulating on the black market. That is, local residents had found some. The researchers asked around, went to the place the residents mentioned, and discovered 5 caves. Inside these 5 caves, they found many fragments. It turned out that almost everything found afterward was in fragments, except for one complete scroll found in Cave 11. The ones the shepherd found earlier were all complete. Those have probably all been sold by now, right? There must still be many out there. People took them and tore them into pieces to sell. Now that they deliberately tore them, the material is very fragile and breaks easily just by touching. Each fragment could be sold for a good amount of money, and then you could try to piece them together. And if you piece them together, maybe you can understand the text. It was easier to sell them that way. If you brought out an entire scroll, very few people could afford to buy it. Anyway, inside these 5 caves, some remarkable things were discovered. First, among these 5 caves, there was Cave 4, which yielded the largest number of fragments so far. Most of the fragments came from that cave. In fact, 3/4 of all Dead Sea Scroll fragments came from that single cave. Also, in one of these 5 caves, a very remarkable object was found. It was a copper scroll. All the others were made of parchment or papyrus. This was the only copper one. Engraved on it were words related to treasure. Not one treasure, 64 treasures. The first passage on this scroll says, "Beneath the ruins of the Valley of Anchor, a staircase, an entrance facing east, at a distance of 40 cubits, a silver treasury and containers, 17 talents in weight." It wrote something like that. 40 cubits. At that time, 1 cubit was probably about 46 centimeters. So 40 cubits is about 18.5 meters. In other words, beneath some ruins, there is an entrance facing east. Go inside and walk forward 18.5 meters and you will find a silver treasury containing approximately 17 talents weight. A talent was a unit specifically used to measure precious metals, but a talent is much larger than an ounce. 1 talent was about 26 kilograms. There are a total of 64 such entries in the scroll. And of course, the content continues. It keeps going. After the scroll was deciphered, calculations were made regarding some of the treasures described in it. The total estimated value was about $1 million at the time. Adjusted to today, that would be roughly $10 million. That's not even as valuable as the scroll itself. It's probably not as valuable as the scroll itself. But because the content on the scroll is written very vaguely, and unclearly. To this day, not a single treasure has been found. For example, the first passage mentions the Valley of Anchor. This valley does exist, but it's very large. No one knows which ruins. In fact, they haven't even found any ruins there, and the treasure is supposedly buried beneath those ruins. Another issue is that the Hebrew used on the cover scroll is a very unique form of Hebrew. What does that mean? It's like the scroll is covered in English letters, but you just cannot understand them. That kind of feeling. Each character is recognizable individually, but when put together, you can't quite grasp what they are saying. Also, at the very end of the passage, it says Can, 3 letters. These letters are definitely not Hebrew letters. Some suggest they might be ancient Greek letters. Why would ancient Greek suddenly appear in the text? What does Can mean? It feels like it might be the name of something or someone. But isn't it strange to have a name suddenly appear in the middle of a sentence? Later, after much research, scholars discovered many spelling errors in the text. This led to the theory that the cover scroll might be a copy, and the person who copied it, the scribe who transcribed it, didn't know Hebrew. So he looked at the Hebrew characters, those circles and lines, and carved them as best he could. But the result was crooked and distorted, like a Western foreigner writing Chinese characters. Exactly. He didn't understand the meaning. Also, engraving is obviously harder than writing. If you are just drawing the shapes, it's a bit easier, but engraving them into copper is much more difficult. So, overall, the writing on the scroll is quite crude. This makes the information about the treasure even more ambiguous. On the other hand, if one could find the original manuscript that he was copying from, there might actually be reliable treasure information in it. Why do people think the treasure might actually exist? Here's the why. First of all, the fact that the scroll is made of copper shows that the information was considered extremely important. They didn't want this information to be lost. No one suspects the treasure is fake. Unexpectedly, copper and paper have similar lifespans. Copper also corrodes, breaks apart, and can be lost, just like paper. Clay tablets would have been better. Clay tablets are truly remarkable because they are made of the same material as earth and sand. From that perspective, the Sumerians really understood better how to preserve information for the longest possible time. Another reason is that the cover scroll reveals the source of the treasure. It says that when the kingdom of Israel fell, when it was conquered by others, these Jewish people brought the treasure out. Most of it consisted of state tax revenues, along with some secret objects, hidden in various places. This sounds very plausible. When enemies attacked, you can't let them take everything. So people each took some items and ran away, hiding them in certain places. But the Dead Sea Scrolls are from 2,000 years ago, right? But the fall of Kingdom of Israel happened much earlier than that. Yes, the fall of Israel was about 3,000 years ago. So this is a copy. When people fled back then, they wrote down where these items were hidden. Eventually, all that information was compiled and given to someone to engrave on this copper plate. But that person couldn't read, so it was engraved unclearly, and now no one can find the treasure. Maybe they deliberately chose someone who couldn't read to do the engraving. That's also possible. That way, he couldn't know where the treasure was, right? That further proves the treasure is real. It is real, but it's not very valuable, is it? But it's definitely real gold and real silver, but gold and silver aren't that valuable. Are there any other things? If you say this is a gold of the original kingdom of Israel, as recorded in the Dead Sea Scrolls, then that gold would be priceless. Alright, so scrolls like this continue to be discovered over time. More caves were also found. Finally, by 1956, about 10 years after the first scroll was discovered, a total of 11 caves had been found. Then, in 2017, a 12th cave was discovered. After all those years in between, the greatest value of the Dead Sea Scrolls is not just that they are the oldest version of the Bible, but also that they date back to exactly the period when Jesus was born. So, if it contained any records about Jesus, they could help prove how Christianity originated and also how Judaism developed. Therefore, they could have an impact on several of the world's largest religions. This is why they have attracted the attention of religious people all over the world. Many people are also very worried that the scrolls might contain content that is unfavorable to religion. For example, the Sumerian clay tablets say that humans were created to do hard labor, right? That wouldn't be acceptable. They created us to serve them. If it overturns the very foundation of a religion, that would be disastrous. Many people fear such content exists. So, does it or not? For this reason, the most important task regarding the Dead Sea Scrolls has been interpretation. But people waited a very long time. Information about the Dead Sea Scrolls was not released for ages. They waited 40 years and still nothing was published. This only made people more convinced that the Dead Sea Scrolls might contain something harmful to religion. After the scrolls were collected, they were initially kept by the Catholic Church. The church said, "We will study them and then tell you the results." But they didn't tell. For 40 years, they didn't tell. The Catholic Church's explanation was that they had not yet completed the interpretation, so they couldn't tell everyone what was written in the scrolls. Why did it take so long to interpret them? First, the workload was too enormous. The scrolls were all fragments, with too many missing parts, deterioration, and sections that were illegible. What did that feel like? Imagine receiving an article in this kind of fragmented state and wanting to know what it said. How could you decipher it? You couldn't. Second, these documents could have a major impact on several of the world's largest religions. So, from the very beginning, the deciphering work was carried out in secret. Only a small number of the most authoritative people in the world were allowed to participate in the deciphering. The time and place for the deciphering work were very strictly controlled. As for who could participate, it had to include some of the world's most important religions, as well as people with no religious affiliation. All had to come together to join participate in the deciphering. Once the deciphering work began, it was discovered that the Catholic representatives were assigned more fragments, while other religions received very few fragments. It was unfair. So everyone started fighting and arguing over it. This also caused the deciphering work to be delayed indefinitely. They gave other religions with fragments with no writing on them. Fragments with no writing. Right, fragments with no writing. What was it supposed to look at? So, the opposition between religious factions also made it impossible to proceed with the deciphering. Another issue was that the main Qumran area where the scrolls were discovered, a place where Israel and Jordan were constantly fighting, a conflict zone. Much of the deciphering and exploration work was halted because of war. What about now? Are they continuing the deciphering work now? It was only after 1967 that the deciphering work gradually began to proceed. But as mentioned earlier, the amount was too large, the fragments was too fragmented, and there were too few people working on it. Just a handful of elderly authorities, their eyes probably failing, sitting there trying to look at and understand the meaning. It was very slow. How about release it publicly? Actually, the best approach would have been open it up. Let everyone say it. Then the deciphering would go faster. In fact, in 1991, the United States publicly released a portion of the fragments it held. As soon as the US released them, Israel strongly objected. How can you make them public? We don't even know the content yet. But the US ignored the objection and released them anyway. After that, the deciphering speed increased. Many more expertise became involved. Finally, in 2009, the entire 40 volumes of the Dead Sea Scrolls were made public. Whether there are other volumes, no one knows, but currently it's said that is all, 40 volumes. This means from the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls to the full release of their content took over 60 years. Alright, next question. Who were the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls? The Dead Sea Scrolls come from various time periods, roughly from the 3rd century BC to the 1st century AD. Who exactly the authors were has long been uncertain. The current mainstream view is that they were written by a branch of Judaism at the time called Essenes. They lived in the desert near Qumran. This sect was very different from mainstream Judaism. They practiced what is called asceticism, the rejection of desire. So they lived in the desert, kept to themselves, and led a life of contentment in poverty. It is said that because the faith of this sect was exceptionally strong, most of them possessed supernatural abilities. However, this branch suddenly disappeared from history. Later, some clues were found within the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some of the content in the Dead Sea Scrolls clearly opposes the mainstream Jewish sects of the time. Think about it. These are texts from a Jewish group, yet they oppose the mainstream Jewish sects. This indicates they indeed belong to a different faction. This aligns with the hypothesis that they were Essenes, because Essene ideology was different from the mainstream Jewish thought of the time. But here's a strange thing. The timing of this sect's disappearance coincides exactly with the appearance of Jesus. After Jesus appeared, no one mentioned this sect anymore. The New Testament mentions other Jewish sects but never mentions this one. This has led people to a bold hypothesis, that is, Jesus may come from this sect. Why? Because Jesus' own words and actions are particularly consistent with this sect. Jesus lived a reclusive life and practiced asceticism. Moreover, Jesus had supernatural abilities. He could heal people, for example. Because of his miracles, people believed he was divine, the Son of God, right? Also, Jesus opposed the Judaism of his time, which is why he founded Christianity. So, his outward characteristics align very well with those of the Essenes. Furthermore, the fact that the Essenes are not mentioned in the New Testament suggests that they may not have disappeared. Instead, they may have transformed into what later became Christianity, that is, with Jesus as their representative. The Essenes were carried forward and expanded. They didn't vanish, they just changed their name. Of course, this is only a hypothesis based on the form Jesus manifested and the timing of events. There is no solid evidence. You might want to ask, they lived like ascetics in the desert. How could they amass such great wealth? They didn't have wealth. They only had treasure maps. They remembered where these treasures were hidden, so that when the time came to restore the kingdom, they could use those treasures. They didn't love wealth, that's why these maps could be entrusted to them. If you gave them to someone who loved money, they would just plunder everything for themselves, right? Later in 2021, researchers at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands used AI to analyze the most complete Dead Sea Scroll discovered early on. They found that this particular scroll was written by 2 people. On the surface, it looked as if one person had written the entire scroll. The handwriting was identical throughout, but the AI determined that the scroll, consisting of 54 sections, changed to a second writer starting exactly at section 27. Although the handwriting looked the same, the speed of writing, the use of muscles, and the transmission of force is different. Therefore, they concluded it was written by 2 people. The handwriting was the same, but the writing speed differed. The way force was applied and the turns differed, meaning the 2 people held the pen differently. So, how did they manage to make the handwriting identical? That's remarkable. It suggests there were specialized schools that trained these scribes. Everyone wrote the same way. In fact, between section 27 and section 28 of the first scroll, a seam was indeed found. The 2 sections were sewn together. At first, no one knew why it was sewn. Was it broken in the middle and then mended? Later, they realized, from the very beginning, the scroll had been split into 2 parts, with 2 people copying separately to make the work faster. Finally, they sewed the 2 parts together to look like one scroll. Without AI, this would not have been detectable. Initially, handwriting experts had examined it and concluded it was written by a single person. Humans cannot tell the difference. That's amazing. Because they deliberately wanted to write identically, they intentionally made it indistinguishable. This confirms that it is a copy, not originally written by one person from start to finish. From this, we can also infer that other scrolls may not have been written by single individuals either, right? Many people wrote together. This way, the work was faster. Alright, next let's talk about the most important content of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It is currently known that the Dead Sea Scrolls include copies of the Old Testament, apocrypha, pseudepigrapha, prophecies, community rules, laws, knowledge, also called wisdom literature, astronomy, rituals, magic. Pretty fascinating, right? From the content of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we can see some of the life patterns and living conditions of Jewish believers from the pre-Christian era. However, the scrolls do not clearly mention Christianity, nor do they mention the person of Jesus. We won't go through most of the content, but I will focus on introducing some things, specifically whether there is anything in the scrolls that might be considered unfavorable to religion, which is what people were most concerned about from the beginning. If it matches exactly what religion says, we don't care about that. What we want to know is if there's anything different. In fact, most of the content in the scrolls does not conflict with modern religion. However, there are some parts that might indeed spark discussion. For example, fragments of the Book of Enoch appeared among the Dead Sea Scrolls. For a long time, the Book of Enoch was considered pseudepigrapha by both Judaism and Christianity. The most complete version of the Book of Enoch was discovered in the 17th century in a church in Ethiopia. It was later believed to be a fabricated composition, not originally part of the Bible, and was defined by most denominations as a forbidden book. People were told this book was made up, don't believe it. People of our denomination cannot read this book. Having said that, some denominations have now begun to accept the Book of Enoch. Did it say something bad? What exactly did the Book of Enoch contain that caused it to be labeled pseudepigrapher? Enoch, in the Book of Enoch, is the great-grandfather of Noah, the father of Noah's grandfather. So, this book describes events from the time of Noah's great-grandfather, things that happened between humans and God. It says that God sent down 200 angels to earth to watch over humanity. The word used for this watching is watch, to observe, to monitor humans. So these angels were originally called watchers. Why did God want to observe and monitor humans? It doesn't say. Then as time passed, some of these watchers developed feelings for human women, and they mated with them. This produced the Nephilim, the giants. These angels who mated with humans later came to be called fallen angels, with their leader being Lucifer. The fallen angels then fought against God, all because of humans. In the end, the fallen angels could not defeat God. So, God sent the great flood with the purpose of destroying the Nephilim, the offspring of angels and humans. That is the story contained in the Book of Enoch. Now, since this story appears in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are two possibilities. Either the Book of Enoch is not pseudepigrapher, that it was originally part of the Old Testament, and that during the development of the religion, the story of the Book of Enoch was later deemed perhaps inappropriate, detrimental to God's image in people's hearts. So the content was deleted. Another possibility is that the Book of Enoch is indeed pseudepigrapher, but it is pseudepigrapher from over 2,000 years ago. In either case, neither possibilities actually presents a serious problem. After all, until an even more ancient version of the Bible appears, we cannot be certain whether this content is authentic or not. Moreover, later people discovered that a church in Ethiopia had produced such a book and deemed it pseudepigrapher. There's nothing wrong with that. So, where is the problem? The issue is this: if the story of the Book of Enoch truly was part of the Bible, it would create another problem. Namely, this story structure is too similar to Sumerian mythology. That is to say, the angels would correspond to Enki's Set, while God would correspond to Enlil's Set. This matches the reason for the Great Flood that we discussed earlier. In other words, Enki actually wanted to save humanity, while Enlil's Set wanted to destroy humanity. In essence, God's Set wanted to destroy humanity, whereas the fallen angels actually saved lives. If this structure is identical, it creates a problem. The Sumerian clay tablets are much older than the Old Testament. If the Bible is too similar to Sumerian mythology, it would suggest that the Bible might have originated from Sumerian mythology, and that would be very damaging to religion. But you might want to say that it's not just Sumerian mythology that resembles the Bible. Many Japanese myths are also very similar. Yes, mythologies from all over the world are very similar. It's possible that they collectively recorded a real historical event, that something actually happened, and the descriptions differ slightly depending on perspective and standpoint, rather than one coming from another. Explaining it this way can better avoid certain disputes, and I hope everyone will understand the issue in this way. If you insist that one came from another, then there will be a question of precedence, earlier versus later, and that would be problematic. Most importantly, the appearance of the Dead Sea Scrolls proves that the Bible is not a modern product. It is a product of the early stages of human civilization, and very likely has a direct connection to the very birth of human civilization. That is its value. Since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, fragments claiming to be from them have continuously appeared on the black market. The prices are extremely high, but in fact, most of them are forgeries. And it's not just the black market. In 2020, the 16 fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls held in the Washington Bible Museum were all authenticated as forgeries. They ended up with forgeries too. These were the museum's crown jewels, all of them forgeries. This was officially announced and verified by the museum itself. It is said that these forgeries were crafted with exceptional skill, fooling even top experts. Then how did they discover they were forgeries? How did they know these fragments were fake? They conducted in-depth compositional analysis and found that while the parchment was genuine Asian paper, the ink was modern. Various Asian treatments had been applied to make them look exactly like the real Dead Sea Scrolls. Where did they get Asian paper? The Asian paper came from the desert. There were many leather items from that time, such as shoes. The material extracted from those items was the same as parchment. However, sometimes a hole would be found in the paper, a hole from where a shoe's eyelet had been, something that shouldn't appear on a scroll. That's how they knew the paper was wrong. Initially, they tested 5 fragments and found all of them fake. Since all 16 fragments came from the same source, they determined that all 16 were forgeries. And where did these fragments come from? They came from the son of the antique dealer from Bethlehem I mentioned earlier, Kendall. So he had real ones, but he sold fakes too. Yes, he was constantly acquiring these items. He was very famous, which is why the experts initially let the guard down. They assumed anything from him must be genuine. Did he know they were fake? He probably didn't know either. He was just the one collecting them. That means many of the fragments currently recognized as genuine Dead Sea Scrolls may actually be fakes. We just don't know it yet. So, the content discussed above, whether it is authentic or not, cannot be guaranteed either. Currently, the work of authentication is ongoing, and the work of deciphering is also ongoing. Furthermore, even if the fragments are genuine, the content is so severely fragmented that most of what has been deciphered so far is still speculative. For example, if a single word like not in the middle is not correctly interpreted, the entire meaning becomes completely different. It is also possible that fragments discovered later could completely overturn previous conclusions, and new fragments are still being discovered. One particularly interesting thing that came out of the deciphering work is that, in 2018, researchers discovered that the solar calendar used by the Jews at that time had 364 days a year, one day less than the current calendar. Why 364 days? The scrolls explain that it is because 364 is divisible by 7. That way, every festival would fall on the same day of the week each year. This was very important to Judaism. This is because Judaism places great emphasis on weekly cycle. There are specific rules about which days to rest, which days to work, and which days not to work. If after a few weeks a festival fell on a day when work was forbidden, or on a day but celebration wasn't allowed. That would be very strange, so they used 364 days. It's not that they didn't know a year has 365 days. Rather, they deliberately used 364 days because it was more convenient and practical. That was their wisdom. They knew everything, but they chose what worked best for them. Great wisdom. What do you think of the Dead Sea Scrolls? Leave your thoughts to the comments. See you next time.